welcome to the last bit of our chapter 10.7 notes. We are starting up with example 5, which is what happens if we have complex numbers and we need to do division? What do? Unfortunately, we need to rationalize because even though an I doesn't look like a square root, it is a square root. Remember that I is equal to the square root of -1, so it is a radical. And therefore, if it's in the denominator, we're not all the way simplified yet. Okay? So, to rationalize, let's take a look. In part A, we have 1 plus I over I. Well, we have an I in the denominator, which is the problem. And to get rid of that I, what you're going to do is just multiply by something to make it a real number. So if we multiply the numerator and denominator by an I, what's going to happen in the denominator is we'll have I times I, which would be I squared. And we know that I squared equals -1. So in the denominator, we're going to have an I squared, which is really -1. Okay? In the numerator, we do need to distribute that I. So we're going to have 1 times I, which is I, plus we're going to have I times I, which is I squared, and yet again, remember, I squared is -1. So in the numerator, we'll have I plus -1 or I minus 1. We can do the division, so why not? So divide by -1, I divided by -1 would be -I. And -1 divided by -1 would be a +1. So -1 plus I, if you want to rearrange that, so we're in standard form, that would be a 1 in front, and then it'd be the -I second. So 1 minus I, if you want to be in standard form. Okay? Our next one, we don't have a monomial, we have a binomial in the denominator. We have 4 minus 3i, and again, since we have an I in the denominator, we're not simplified yet, because it is a radical. So to get rid of this, as tempting as it is to just multiply by the same thing, that won't help you because you're going to have middle terms. You want some of the middle terms are going to cancel out, which is why we multiply by the conjugate. So just refresher, the conjugate, it looks like the same two terms, but the middle sign is switched. So instead of 4 minus 3i, we're going to have 4 plus 3i. And the reason we're doing that is so that our middle terms cancel out and we don't have any i's in it. And of course, whatever you multiply the denominator by, we're going to multiply the numerator by the same thing, so that we're multiplying by 1 and we're staying equivalent to where we started out. Okay? So let me show you what's going to happen in the denominator first. So in the denominator, we're going to distribute. We're going to have 4 times 4, which will be 16. We're going to have 4 times positive 3i, which is positive 12i. We're going to have negative 3i times 4, which would be a negative 12i. Which, as you can see, they're going to cancel. That's exciting. And then we're also going to have a negative 3i times a positive 3i, which will give us negative 9i squared. We'll get to the numerator in a second, but let's go ahead and cancel those 12i's out. That's always fun. And then the other thing is now we have an I squared. And you guys remember, I squared equals -1. So we've got negative 9 times -1, which would be positive 9. So in the denominator, you're going to have 16 plus 9, which would be 25. All right, let's look at our numerator now. We're going to distribute up there as well, but it may not end up quite as pretty as the denominator. So let's see how that works out. We'll have 6 times 4, which is 24. We're going to have 6 times 3i, which will be 18i. We're going to have 2i times 4, which will be I. And we'll have 2i times 3i, which is 6i squared. Okay? Now I see some like terms already. I see an 18i and an 8i. And if we add those together, 18 plus 8 is 26. So we'll have 26i. We'll still have a plus 24. And then we also have this plus 6i squared. And remember, I squared is -1. So we'll have 6 times -1, which is -6. And now I've got a few more like terms, right? Now we have the 24 and the -6. So 24 minus 6 would be 18. So now I've got 18 plus 26i all over 25, we do always double check that nothing simplifies, and in this case, it's not going to simplify. 25 is 5 times 5, and 18 and 26, they are not divisible by 5. So there's nothing that everything's divisible by. So we can't simplify further. We're done. Okay. Last thing we're going to look at is powers of I. So I'm going to make a little chart because there's patterns, and it's always fun to see patterns. And if we can look at those patterns, then you can look at any kind of exponent a lot easier, instead of having to write out 102 i's, which I'm sure nobody really wants to do, okay? So let's look at i's, and we're just going to look at the first few and see some patterns, okay? So first off, let's just start with I to the first. So I to the first would just be I, right? Next up, I to the second. That would be I times I, and we know that I squared is -1. Good. Next up, we'll have I to the third. So I to the third, if it helps, let's just take the previous one. That's the same thing as I squared times I. We know that I squared is -1, so you're going to have -1 times I, which is -I. Next up is I to the fourth. So I to the fourth would be I to the third times I, right? So I to the third, we just figured out that I to the third is -I. So now I've got -I times I. So then we'd have -I squared, right? And I squared is -1. And the opposite of -1 would be +1. Okay? Let's keep on going. Let's see what happens with I to the fifth. So I to the fifth would be I to the fourth times 1, right? Times 1. And we just figured out that I to the fourth is 1. So now I've got 1 times I, which is just I. Next up would be I to the sixth. So I to the sixth would be I to the fifth times I. And I to the fifth, we just figured that out. It's I, right? So now I've got I times I, which would be I squared. And we all know that I squared is -1. After I to the sixth, we have I to the seventh. So I to the seventh would be I to the sixth times I. We just figured out that I to the sixth is -1. So now I've got -1 times I, which would be -I. And let's do one more just for fun. I to the eighth. So I to the eighth would be I to the seventh times I. And we just figured out that I to the seventh is -I. So now I've got -I times I, which seems really familiar. It has a little bit of deja vu to it, doesn't it? Because we just did that up here and got -I squared. And of course, I squared is -1, so now I'm doing the opposite of -1, which is +1. Okay? And hopefully you guys are starting to see a pattern. I, -1, -I, 1. I, -1, -I, 1. And we have this pattern of 4 that keeps repeating itself over and over and over again. For the sake of our own sanity, and to help you guys out a little bit, I'd actually do 1 before the I to the first, which would be I to the 0. Do you guys remember, anything to the 0 power is 1. And I is no exception. I to the 0 is also 1. And so we have this pattern of 4 things. And so the easy way to tell when you get to these larger exponents, and I'm sure you don't want to write out 102 i's anytime soon, is to actually look at your remainder if you divide by 4. And your remainder, when you divide by 4, you're either going to get a remainder of 0, it divides perfectly, in which case it equals 1. You might get a remainder of 1, in which case it's equal to I. You might get a remainder of 2, in which case it equals -1, or you might get a remainder of 3, which would give you -I. And so we can look at that remainder, and it's going to be one of these 4 choices. You ready to try it? Good. So the first one I have down here is I to the 28th. Alright, so if I do the exponent 28, and I divide by 4, what I get is 7. It divides out perfectly, which means you have a remainder of 0. So if I have a remainder of 0, then that means that it's equivalent to I to the 0, which means that I to the 28th is 1. So I to the 28th is equivalent to I to the 0, which is 1. Okay, let's try another one. Next up, I have I to the 39th. So if I do the same thing, if I do 39 divided by 4, what I get is 9 with a remainder of 3. It's 9 and 3/4. So your remainder is 3. Okay? Or if you want to type it in your calculator, you'll get 9.75, which is 3/4. Okay? So that 3 means that I to the 39th is equivalent to I to the 3rd, which would be -1, or negative I. So I to the 39th equals -I. And see, that's not that bad. Really, if you have these 4 memorized, or honestly, if you don't have them memorized, you can make that chart pretty fast and easy for yourself. Then you can do these quickly. Okay, we have I to the 102nd. Oh no, what will I do? Well, I'm going to do 102 divided by 4, right? And when I do 102 divided by 4, I'm going to get 25.5, which is the same thing as 25 with a remainder of 2/4, right? So my remainder is 2. So I to the 102nd is equivalent to I squared, which we all know is -1. Alright, last up is, what if you get a negative exponent? What do I do? Well, probably the easy way to go is I to the -9th is the same thing as 1 over I to the 9th, right? So let's figure out what I to the 9th is, and then we can do 1 over, since it's a negative exponent instead, okay? So if you do 9 divided by 4, you're going to get 1 and 3/4, so it has a remainder of 3. Has a remainder of 3, that means it's equivalent to I to the 3rd, which is -I. So really, this is the same thing as 1 over -I. And then you're going to say, that's not simplified. It has an I in the denominator. Alright then, let's multiply by I over I to simplify it a little bit more. Okay? So let's see, 1 times I is I. -I times I is -I squared. And we all know that I squared is -1. So the opposite of -1 is +1. So now I've got I over 1, which is just I. Alright, last one, I promise, is I to the -22nd. And let's do the same idea here, okay? So that's the same thing as 1 over I to the 22nd. So if you do 22 divided by 4, and see what that does, you're going to get 5.5, or 5 2/4. So that means it has a remainder of 2. So that means that it's equivalent to I squared. I squared equals -1. So for us, we have 1 over -1. And 1 divided by -1 is -1. Okay? Hopefully that'll help you guys get started, and I hope you guys are having a wonderful week.